Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China has made many breakthroughs and achievements in high-tech manufacturing in recent years. In the fourth quarter of 2023, China's electric vehicle maker BYD surpassed Tesla to become the best-selling pure EV maker in the world. On January 1st, China's first domestic-made large cruise ship made its first commercial voyage. So what is driving China's technological rise? How will China's high-tech manufacturing affect the world? And what's in store for the future of China high-tech industry? Join us for today's discussion from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining us today are Professor Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, David Mahon, Executive Chairman of Mahon China Investment Management, Pascal Coppens, keynote speaker and author on Chinese innovation, and Professor Liang from Willamette University. Welcome to Dialogue. So, John, I will start with you. Can we say for sure with the latest development that there is a rise of high-tech manufacturing in China?
Well, absolutely. I would say China, has made great stride in making innovations, in special innovations related to manufacturing. It's a great industrial power. It is on the cutting edge on a lot of rising, sun-rising industries. And I think, there's a fundamental reason behind this. I think it has a lot to do with, Chinese government's industrial policy, R&D policy, science and development policy. I vividly remember, I think it's in 2012 or 2013 timeframe, there was an article in a very revered journal called Harvard Business Review, pointedly titled, this article entitled, Can Chinese Companies Innovate? Now looking back, after I would say more than 10 years, a decade later, it's just really a laughing stock to me that somebody will write up something like this and get published in a very prestigious business journal. Definitely Chinese companies can innovate and has been innovating a great heck of things. And I would also point out that a lot of innovations happen in the defense industries. I think, if anything, the technological gap between China and the West is probably closed more prominently in the defense sector. In a couple of areas, actually, Chinese defense industries are leading. So I think, definitely, to answer your question, definitely is a resounding yes.
Okay. So, Liang, if the Chinese companies can innovate, and if China is a tech power, if not a superpower, so how has China transformed itself into a world leader in science and technology? Within just, we are talking about a few decades, right?
Right. Good to talk to you, Qinduo. So I agree with John. I think if you look at the varieties of products, going from defense technologies, as he mentioned, to solar panel, to civilian drones, to mobile phones, China in many of these product categories occupy over 70% of the global markets. And so I think that is extraordinary. And I think what John emphasized here is there is a great support from the government. And by support, I not only mean policy incentives, regulations, but also public investments directly. Take EV as example. The government has helped to secure mining and refineries abroad through public investments from the upstream, but then also to the downstream. The government has invested 1.8 million public charging stations compared to United States, 140,000 of them. So I think government really plays a very weighty role. But in China, I think there are also other ingredients that really help it succeed. And that includes, for example, very solid manufacturing base that has been accumulating over the decades. There's also talents. We have 4.7 million STEM graduates every year, and also very talented entrepreneurs who are very innovation driven. We also have huge pool of money, right? It takes capital to make these innovations. We have private lending. We also have public, government guided investment funds. They're also very helpful in financing these endeavors. And last but not the least, I think we also have very broad, big market that are able to create the kind of scale effect and also very broad public support. Think about, consumers, they really are ready to embrace EVs, and they have very low, for example, the range anxieties compared to the United States. So I think all these 5 important components are really what drive the Chinese innovations and also commercializations of these technologies.
Well, innovation and commercialization. Pascal, you are the expert on the Chinese innovation. So how do you see, what are the secret recipe to the Chinese innovation? How different is it? I mean, if there's any, with say like Western innovation?
Yeah, I believe that the secret is not so different from anywhere else, but maybe the way that it has been developing is quite different, meaning that there was a lot of effort in the early of this century on infrastructure, on creating more talent, and mainly creating the foundation blocks that are needed. And so a lot of people wanted to become the best suppliers in the world from China to deliver to the world. That meant they needed to be very cost sensitive, and that is where I would say that the optimization of cost was important, and innovation was actually needed to make that happen over time. But then I think after 2008, it's more about the digital environment and consumers embracing this innovation these days. And then later on, since I would say 2015, there was a clear direction of the government, a clear direction to say we need to become a leader in innovation on a global level. And that's when they switched more from a domestic focus into a global focus to be able to compete with global brands. And that meant quality had to go up. And it was really about inventions more and more. And so this is the phase we're in now. It's this phase where you could see that innovation has become part of the blood of China to actually move forward into that future.
So David, you have been living in China for decades. You understand China here. The government played a role, obviously. But if you look at the EV sector, for example, as we mentioned, the BYD overtaking Tesla in terms of the production. Of course, BYD is not alone. You have, Chery and other brands from the Chinese market. They are also setting the sales records, one after another. So what factors, will you, attribute it to in terms of the EV market, the EV makers' success that's so far?
I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that there has been the very accurate role by government. Without the government support in terms of backing businesses, making capital available, land to build the very factories that these cars or the componentry for the vehicles are made. This is a very important role. And also building the infrastructure in advance of the actual arrival of the vehicles, which is one of the great barriers in many Western countries. They just don't have the structure. I mean, we've just had a figure there of China has 10 times the infrastructure for charging vehicles than the United States. Another thing I think which is very important that has 2 aspects. One is positive and one is negative. And that's the way that Chinese provinces, cities within provinces, even counties, all compete with each other. So we actually have too many EV producers. So like anything where there's a great initiative by government and massive participation by both private and state-owned companies, you get oversupply. And this has also been a feature of the growth of the EV market. The point about that is that China seems able to tolerate and latterly absorb oversupply in sectors. So we're now moving towards, I think, increasing consolidation amongst these stronger players that you've mentioned. And they're going to become the biggest vehicle companies in the world. 2 of them already are. So China has a unique confluence of forces which are not so common in Western countries.
John, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to. David made a very good point about the role of local governments, but we'll be very careful about this because, as you know, the European Union is initiating investigation
about subsidies, right?
Electric automobile market industry, whether it has been subsidized or not. Well, the point I'm trying to make is that absolutely there's a role being played by local governments in terms of attracting these businesses resources in helping them setting up things up, and also in a way to make a life a lot easier for these companies. But we have to keep in mind this is all driven by market competition. Actually, every time when people talk about industrial policy in China, I always have the view that the industrial policy, as we understand it, played by the central government in China, in my view, is very limited. Actually, most of the these help come from the government are from the local governments, and this is actually not from the central government from a decree or something. It's all purely driven by market competition. In other words, the companies. The local governments have an incentive to help and assist the companies based in their jurisdiction to succeed in the market. And what that means is the tax revenues, the jobs, the infrastructure funds that be available for the local cities and all that kind of thing. So-called government subsidy. Is really driven by market competition, which is very unique if you think about it, okay? So it's market competition driven government's role in helping these companies to succeed. And I'm not sure this is a bad idea, actually. If you look at the end result here, we have a very competitive electric car market. Normally, automobile industry has a Hoffenheim index, which, economics and antitrust, we call Hoffenheim index, which is, close to 2,000, 1,500 at least, but here in China it's less than 1,000. We have over 100 brands, companies fiercely competing in this market. Is this a bad idea? I'm not sure, actually. I mean, certainly consumers are benefiting from it. I mean, the electric cars prices here in China is probably the most competitive in the world, right? And even if we speak of exports, I think it's not a bad idea. The European consumers are enjoying, very competitively priced electric vehicles, whether it be from China or not. Doesn't really matter to me.
Liang, if you look at the role by the central government, people would point to this 5-year plan or the long vision, long-term practice, developing the country's technology, innovation, either EV or the mobile phone or the 5G, for example. That's something, it's almost like unique to the Chinese practice?
Well, I don't think it's unique in the sense that, China, like many other countries, are trying to accomplish the so-called high-quality growth. And this is growth that is not relying on extensive inputs of resources to growth, but rely on technology, productivity growth, and inclusive growth. And so I think that is part of China's grand development strategies. And other countries similarly share this kind of ambition. I think what makes China unique, as John was talking about, is you have this confluences of, central government is providing public investments, financing, regulations, policies to support these businesses. And the local governments, on the other hand, are also, helping the local businesses to thrive and also prompt them to compete and to strengthen their competitiveness. And I think, honestly, subsidies that, happen everywhere. I mean, in the United States where I live, we have Infrastructure Act, we have Inflation Reduction Act, we have Chips and Science Act. I recently bought a Tesla. I got $75,000 federal subsidies for purchasing the car. And Europeans are the same. They subsidize the production, they subsidize the purchases at the consumer end. So I think subsidies is really unusual practice in that sense. It's not really, unique to the Chinese government. But at the same time, I agree. I think the local governments are really helping a lot, not just providing, sort of easy financing, but more importantly, help to coordinate, the supply chain, and also to help to, recruit talents and so on and so forth. So governments do play a very important role, but I don't think any of these is sort of very unique to China in the sense of violating, WTO rules. So for the WTO rules, as John mentioned, you have to have tangible evidence that this subsidies is to undercut foreign competitions, and it also has to produce the so-called tangible harms to these manufacturers. Now, in terms of China's EV market share in Europe right now is about 8%. Volkswagen alone in China occupies more than 10% market share. So when it comes to this whole idea of harms, I think China should have a bigger concern, right, or bigger reason to file this WTO sort of a complaint. One last point I want to make is I think it's very helpful for actually governments to help to promote EV production and adoption, for the grander goal, bigger scheme of things of, achieving green transition and fight climate change. So I think if governments do try to subsidize and try to promote the EV industries and other green technologies, other green energies, I think that it's great. But again, if you're using, this kinds of excuses, right, or using this government prerogatives to, ban Chinese imports or, levy very high tariffs on Chinese cars. For example, in the United States, now 17.5%, and they're still looking at raising the tariff rates. So I think all these would really backfire. I think that would not help, these countries' competitiveness and will hurt the consumers and also delay their green transitions.
Well, if you take a look at other sectors, Pascal, last year China's clean energy industry also showed this rapid and strong development. For example, the actual new installed capacity of wind and solar power in China far exceeds the target of 160 gigawatts set by the National Energy Administration. According to prediction, in the 2023 amount of China's newly installed photovoltaic capacity may account for half of the world's total. In addition, the total production of lithium batteries in China increased by 31% in the first 10 months of 2023. So do you see a similar development path maybe with the new and renewable energy together with, for example, other sectors like the EV, like the mobile phone, like the other renewable energies there?
Well, I believe that in general, the whole new energy market has been driven by a need from the market, and this is often where it starts. But I've lived in China for a long, long time, and you didn't have to explain to consumers that there was a pollution problem in China. Some of the cities where we really have heavy pollution. And so it ended up that people actually understood there needed to be something done, and the government supported that very much. Now, on top of that, in that specific market, what you saw is that there was a market demand globally starting to be created, but definitely in China. And China, on top of that, needed also to look at just energy independence, because it became also a more geopolitical environment these days, which meant that China needed to take care of its own energy. And so if you combine a need to somehow be more independent, a need for transitioning towards the future, and a market demand, what that creates in China is a huge amount of companies and brands that all are fighting and competing. And that is what Professor Yan just said, it's really about the bottom up. This is about the bottom-up competition. It's not about the subsidies from the government. It's not about the support from the government. It's about wanting to be leading in a market that has a demand. And that is when there's really a lot of things happening in China. And you could almost say that it's against all odds that of what the government is often doing, that these companies, specifically private companies like a BYD or a Geely, had to compete with sometimes state-owned enterprises. And so against all odds, they had to innovate. They had to become competitive. And they are doing that in many markets. So some of these markets like the EV are very visible these days. But there's many other markets where the same pattern is happening, where the same pattern of a big market demand, a global market demand is happening, whether you look at biotech or you look at chemicals or you look at any kind of market where there's a lot of high tech needed, but then also a combination where the government feels that, the transformation is needed to support the country to develop. And so when you have that combined with then the resilience of the Chinese innovators and the Chinese companies really wanting to compete in their home market and now on a global level, well, that is when that creates quality over quantity. I mean, scale is one thing and oversupply is one thing, but on top of that, there's also quality. And so that is what we're seeing in many, many different markets. So I think what we're seeing in the EV market and in the battery market and the renewable energy market is kind of a potential blueprint for many other markets to come. And so we have to look, in my view, to understand what China really has for the world to offer, more at the bottom up, and how they are trying to differentiate themselves amongst themselves rather than thinking that they actually are just waiting for the money from the central government and then try to compete on the global markets. That's not the way it goes. It often is how we perceive it, however, in Europe and in the West.
Well, Joy, of course, with the rapid rise of Chinese tech power, there are concerns, from, say, countries like the United States. There's export restrictions on chips, advanced chips in particular. How is that probably blocking or preventing the rise of China's, in particular, the development like Huawei and other companies?
Well, I think, the so-called competition between the United States and China, as we all understand, is all about competition in high tech, right? In some ways, I think the Europeans probably hold the same view that, the hundreds long sort of technological supremacy of the West is being challenged by the Chinese. And I think behind this statement by von der Leyen, the European Commission chairman, that China represents a systematic rival or whatever, or challenge, okay, is it is, in my view, is the fear that the good old days are gone, that Chinese technology is about to challenge the dominance of the Western technology for hundreds of years, and I think that's where this fear and scare is coming from. Now, so it's not surprising to me that the West, particularly the United States, is cocking up something that trying to slow China down. I think the international relations professor, very famous guy, Mersheimer, famously said, "We got to slow China down. We got to slow China down." Right? I mean, I think the U.S. policy is mostly about slowing China down instead of trying to run faster by itself. It's trying to.
But the question is like, can China overcome that, the force from the U.S.?
Yeah. So I think if you look at the impact of these policies, so-called small yard, high fence policies, right? I don't think they're going to make a much difference in the long run. I mean, historically, these things have been tried before. Actually, vis-a-vis the United States, the British Empire used to adopt something very similar to prevent the textile technologies from crossing the Atlantic Ocean, right? They did the same thing to the United States, but over time, these policies invariably failed. So, if anything, actually, it achieves the opposite effect. Preparing Chinese indigenous companies to even more investing in self capabilities, in innovation. So it actually accelerates technology development here in China. Maybe, the Huawei's chip capability, the new phone coming from Huawei is probably just one example, a tip of the iceberg of things to come. So I'm very skeptical about the effectiveness of this kind of a policy. But nevertheless, on the other side, if you really think of standing in the other side's shoes, they got to try these policies, even though they probably understand it's not going to succeed eventually, but they still have to try it. So they will do it anyway. They will do it anyway. Yeah. So that's the tragedy of the big power politics, right? So we're gonna be faced with this competitive landscape, and hopefully, I would say, America adopts a more positive attitude. I think I'm actually in agreement with some of the with what Pottinger said. Actually, he said competition is not necessarily a bad thing, and I totally agree. Competition is not necessarily a bad thing. Other than that, the other side should compete by making itself run faster. Our friend Aida Modu has a very famous example about Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan, in the ice skating competition, figure skating competition, right? Yeah. Harding hires somebody to strike Nancy Kerrigan's knees. Okay, this is what we call by slowing the other sides down, right? So this is not the way to compete. So I think this is a very good example to summarize the nature of this competition between the United States and China.
Well, Liang, if you look at the number of patents China has filed for the past years, as well as the number of papers most cited around the world, China ranks number 1 for years. But that says something about the Chinese innovation, right?
Right, absolutely. So I think you're right that China is playing a really leading role right now in a lot of the innovations in the cutting edge technologies. As a matter of fact, according to Australia's think tank, China's innovations capability is now leading in 37 critical industries out of 44. So that just shows that China has becoming a innovative powerhouse. That said, I think the next step, of course, is trying to commercialize some of these cutting edge technologies. And I think learning by doing is what China has been doing. And going back to the examples of the cruise line, I know that the localization rate of 30% has made people doubt that if China really have the capabilities. But this has been really China's MO, right? That they will start to introduce foreign technologies, adapt these technologies, and then absorb these technologies and reverse engineer and start to innovate itself. And so many of the industry experts argue that China is able to master some of the core technologies of shipbuilding in next 15 to 20 years. And going back to the patent, it's interesting to know that during this 5 years of making this cruise ship, China actually has filed 400 patents related to the shipbuilding and standardization and so on and so forth. So I think, again, this is a learning process that China is leaping forward. And I also agree with John. I think the U.S.'s and Europeans' strategies of containing China is only going to galvanize the all society mobilization of resources, capital, talent, government supports, entrepreneurship. All this will help to produce, even faster technological developments. Just take, semiconductor chips, which is what I think what the United States is doubling down on its spend. But when you look at the semiconductor foundry capacity, China grew from 0% of the global capacity back in 2005 to now 24%. And then look at Huawei's, Mate 60 Pro. And I think all of these are just, evidence that, this kind of containment strategy is not going to work. And in the long term, I think really what needs to happen is like what John was suggesting, that we need to have constructive competition, that each country needs to try their best to innovate and to deliver the best products for the demand.
David, your last words?
I think there are negatives to competition too. The competition between the States and China means that many companies globally, because the States prohibits them dealing with China in high tech, are suffering and are losing massive profits every month. So that's bad for the global economy. So I think there are some downsides too. But in the end, the incumbent power facing a situation as America's facing now in competition from China, acting the way it is acting, it will lose. And ultimately, China will win through. So China has a unique situation as an emerging market and a developed country as well. It has a massive domestic population and tremendous intellectual resources and a well-educated population. So this is something that I think will underpin the ongoing preeminence in so many areas in technology.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.